Well, we've been talking about religious discrimination and asking you whether you've experienced it or not. And if you have, do give me a call between now and 10 o'clock. I'm taking your calls on this amongst several other things. The number to call is 08000 321 333 on Dotton on Sunday, every week between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And more on religious discrimination. The question is, what can we do about it? Religious discrimination in our midst, as it were. What can we do about it? Well, one thing I suppose we could do about it is to propose new legislation. And that's exactly what my next guest has done. Krupesh Hirani, who's a London Assembly member for Brent and Harrow in northwest London. Well, Krupesh, good evening. Welcome to the show. How on earth do you legislate against religious discrimination? How will it work?
So first of all, I think it's important to say, just to clarify, that I haven't called on new legislation in this area. What I've called for is for the Metropolitan Police to properly record hate crime. Now, we have the 2010 Equality Act, which has defined what workplace harassment is, which is, I think, the area that you've been looking at the moment. And it does already, the Equality Act, cover discrimination against religion or belief. But what we're finding is that when we look at some of the crime statistics across the country and also in London, that they're just not being recorded properly, which then, so if you think about how police forces across the country work, when it comes to decisions that they're making on where to put resources, they look at data and crime statistics. So if it's not being recorded in the first place, then resources will not go into tackling these issues.
I see. So in a way, we're discriminating against the discrimination.
In a roundabout way, yes, but part of it is also, I mean, it's twofold. One is about how the Metropolitan Police are recording it, but secondly is actually encouraging people and communities to report as well. So it is twofold. But what we found in some of the national statistics that the Home Office hold is that hate crimes for, against certain communities are higher than it appears on a national database. And when it comes to local recording on local dashboards, those numbers just aren't showing up in the same volumes as they are nationally. So that's what I'm seeking to address in London.
Yeah, we've heard in recent times, and over the last couple of months, a lot about hate crimes, religiously motivated hate crimes, because of the conflict in the Middle East. So hate crimes, we know, is a particular concern of the Jewish community and the Muslim community at this present time. I imagine that a lot of religious discrimination goes under the radar. Maybe perhaps because we don't quite get it or we don't quite see it. We see if somebody shouts abuse or threatens violence, we see that. But I wonder if religious discrimination is often a lot more subtle than that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to point out what's been happening over in the Middle East at the moment. And, just to take October, for example, it saw a spike in hate crime of 27% following what happened with the violence in Israel and Gaza. And the majority of this spike was from anti-Semitic hate crimes and also Islamophobia. Hate crimes also spiked as well. So you're right to point out whenever there's sort of some sort of international crises or large national international events, it does seem to result in a spike in hate crime here in the UK as well. When you talk about under the radar, that's something actually that's quite close to my mind at the moment because I was having a conversation with someone from the Community Securities Trust, the CST, who do a lot of work around this area. And one of the examples that they spoke to me about was where a Jewish woman at work felt very discriminated against because all her work colleagues, if you like, were constantly just talking about the Israel-Hamas conflict, and it just made her feel very uncomfortable. And in the end, she ended up quitting her job. Now, if you look at crime statistics or it being reported to the police. It wouldn't really show up in some of those statistics, but it's some of those, let's say, issues in the workplace that could end up really impacting people and doesn't get, caught or counted in any statistics.
And you are specifically as well looking at religious discrimination against Hindus. You see, it's something that I can imagine, obviously, when we sit and talk and say, oh, of course, Hindus would face religious discrimination like any other group of people. It may even be intermixed with racial discrimination or cultural discrimination, etc. But I don't hear that in society, particularly as a big problem. And I know it'll be a completely different experience if you are of a Hindu background and you've experienced this. But why in particular are you focusing on discrimination against Hindus?
So what we saw in some of the statistics happening nationally is that in 2022-23, there was a 77% increase from the previous year, which saw recording against Hindus in terms of hate crime. If you look at the victims of hate crimes, Hindus are likely to be the second most likely target of religious hate crime. But as you said, it's not a well-known phenomena, and especially, I imagine in next year's statistics, quite rightly, given what we've seen in terms of the spillover from the Middle East conflict in these statistics, the most certainly in October, victims are more likely to be Jewish or Muslim, but actually there are other groups that have faced discrimination as well. And as you alluded to, every incident of discrimination, when you are the individual, is going to be of paramount importance to you. I recognise, I think you had a caller earlier on that was talking about how they had felt they had been discriminated in the workplace, in particular, following the celebration of Diwali. And it was, I think in this instance, it was a Sikh caller that you had. And it just shows that, if you are practicing a certain faith, then incidents can happen which you would consider yourself that it's a hate crime. If you look at the legislation itself, harassment of this type does not need to be intended by the perpetrator. So it doesn't matter if the person meant to intimidate, because it is the behaviour that is unlawful.
I started off this conversation by asking whether legislation, I know you're not asking for new legislation, but even existing legislation, if legislation can be the answer. Do you believe that we will ever live in a discrimination-free society, at the very least when it comes to um, religious discrimination? Will we ever live in a society where there is no religious discrimination, whether because of legislation or otherwise?
Look, hate crime has, whether it's religion or race, has been in existence for as long as anyone can remember, to be honest. But what we need to do is just make sure that we cut down the barriers and make sure that legislation is there to protect people if they are discriminated. But also, it's not just about legislation. Legislation is not the only answer to this. There's other solutions as well. Whether it's awareness, so making sure that, if you are in the workplace or in school settings or in education, that you make sure that awareness is a big part of your agenda, so that children, for example, going to school can learn about other religions. Many schools take part in interfaith activities where they take children to different places of worship and learn about different communities, and celebrate different festivals as well, and then integration as well. So if you look at interfaith, there's a lot of, especially where I represent across Brent and Harrow, a lot of the places of worship do their best to outreach to other places of worship and work on joint projects, not necessarily around religion, sometimes about, food insecurity, or join up to help with aid relief when it comes to crises overseas. But it's a way of just getting to know each other a bit better and understanding where someone is coming from.
Not sure if it helps to bring in the history. Not sure about that because, of course, there was a time when religious persecution was a thing. It was encouraged. uh, there was legislation that supported it. And we live in a completely different world now. And in the world that we live in now, when we're battling these issues, wrestling philosophically and otherwise with them, and where legislation is part of the tool to change people's attitudes, or at least allow people to live freely and worship freely. Do you
Let, let,
believe that there will ever be a time?
legislation is there to give people protections. I think as someone who obviously represents a large sector of the public in northwest London. I live in hope that we can have a more cohesive society, whether it's locally or nationally as well. And I think the best that we can do is obviously make sure that the protections are there in legislation, but actually we drive the work that brings communities together so that we can all understand in terms of religions or faith or race or whatever protected characteristic, that we are living as much as possible to understand each other's backgrounds and make sure that we live in a peaceful way that's not just tolerating different religions, but actually celebrating and proactively bringing people together.
Thank you. I really appreciate you talking to us, Krupesh.
Thank you.
Krupesh Hirani, they're the London Assembly member for Brent and Harrow.